All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Alexandra Schneider. I am the manager of public programs and visitor services for the History Center, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all this evening to our program, Lake Forest in the Flu's Grippe, the local response to the 1918 influenza pandemic. I'm sure all of you are seasoned Zoom experts by now. But if you want to, you can minimize the small boxes that have everybody popping up. There are some options at the very top that will allow you to control who you can view, or you can also just get rid of everyone if you just want to purely focus on the presentation this evening. If you have any questions, we are going to have a Q&A at the end. If you are worried that you're going to forget your question in the midst of the program, there is a chat option down at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in that question addressed to either Laurie or myself, and we'll go ahead and address it at the end of the program. Otherwise, if I have not already muted you very rudely, I would ask that you mute yourselves now. This is just going to cut down on ambient noise and feedback during the program. But then at the end, when we open up for Q&A, you can go ahead and unmute yourselves. I just want to say also a quick thank you to Maddie Dugan. Tonight's Zoom program broadcast has been very made possible by her generous sponsorship. So thank you so much, Maddie. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our fabulous curator, Laurie Stein, who's going to explore Lake Forest during the 1918 influenza pandemic.
Right. Thank you, Alex. And so glad to be with all of you today. It feels, I would say, especially appropriate to be giving this particular talk via Zoom, right? So we'll be discussing, of course, a time over 100 years ago when Lake Forest and the world were facing another pandemic. Over the past several months, we've all seen articles or news reports comparing the coronavirus with the influenza of 1918. And so today we'll zoom in on our local predecessors from the last century and witness how they encountered a seemingly inexplicable disease, which hopefully will provide some perspective as we do so today. So I'll start with a little bit of local background. In 1918, Lake Forest and Lake Bluff were much smaller towns in both population and land area. Lake Forest had 3,500 people and Lake Bluff 700. What's now West Lake Forest around Waukegan Road was not in the city boundaries yet. However, the community was growing. The population was triple what it had been 25 years earlier. And the town was continuing to confront some of the issues involved in sort of transitioning from a secluded village to a full-fledged Chicago suburb, which was beginning to have very intrinsic connections to its neighboring metropolis, as well as to the two national military establishments on its borders. So all city services at the time were sort of much smaller in scale. There were just two public K-8 schools, Gorton and Halsey. The police department employed just 5 officers. Not then on the force, although he had served as a policeman at various times through the decade, was the man pictured here, Aubrey Moran, who was also a local fireman. But notably for our purposes, he was the town's longtime sanitary inspector, the sole employee of Lake Forest Board of Health. And Warren was from an old Lake Forest family. He had attended Lake Forest Academy and Lake Forest College. His father, William Warren, had been a pioneer underwriter in the insurance industry in the Midwest. And in this business, Aubrey Warren followed in his father's footsteps, though on a local sphere. And it was said of him that no resident of Lake Forest had a wider acquaintance in the city than he, and among all classes, he had many warm friends. And these connections would serve him well in what was to come. So in 1918, the local healthcare resources included Alice Home Hospital, which was located on the campus of Lake Forest College, and the recently built Contagious Hospital, which is located near where South Park is today. And the two hospitals had been founded at different times and were notably separate institutions with separate boards and organizational structures. So Alice Home was designed by architects Frost and Granger in the cottage style. It was built in 1899. just east of where Lois Durand Hall is today, tucked in between two ravines. And in 1918, Alice Home was sort of in the midst of undergoing a comprehensive reconstruction and enlargement, which had been declared necessary in 1916, but was largely put on hold like most building projects during the war. And the project would include a new wing when completed in 1919, which would end up increasing the hospital's capacity to 20 beds. So the Contagious Hospital had opened in 1908, following a fundraising push by residents that resulted in the first Lake Forest Day. And even in the early days of Alice Home Hospital, the community had quickly seen the potential benefit of having a separate isolation hospital equipped to care for contagious diseases, right? Like the measles, tuberculosis, typhoid, scarlet fever, diphtheria, wishing to keep those separate from other medical cases. And so the Contagious Hospital initially included a long building with 4 wards, featuring 4 beds in each ward. And across the narrow courtyard was a caretaker's cottage. The 2 small cottages that you see at north and south were added a bit later, and each contained 2 beds. So between the 2 hospitals, in 1918, Lake Forest had somewhere between 32 and 40 beds. The community was then home to just a handful of doctors and nurses. The longtime physician who had actually helped found Lake Forest Hospital, Dr. A.C. Haven, had actually passed away suddenly early in 1918, and he had not yet been replaced by anyone. Also on the medical staff at the time were Dr. Arthur Dean Bevan, Dr. Bert Newton Parmenter, and Dr. Theodore S. Proxmire. Alice Home had a matron, Catherine Bradley. And they employed a surgical nurse, Belva Staples, and another nurse, Florence Edgar. And the Contagious Hospital also employed a small nursing staff. However, like hospitals and communities across the country at the time, Lake Forest medical community was a bit shorthanded. Dr. Proxmire had joined thousands of his professional colleagues in enlisting in the Army. He was commissioned a major, later lieutenant colonel, and would be put in command of the hospital at Fort Sheridan. So, of course, back in 1918, it was wartime, right? It had been in the spring of 1917 that the US had entered the World War that had been raging in Europe. And the war definitely played a significant role in how influenza spread, how it was treated, how it was discussed in the media, and how it was responded to, both across the world and here in Lake Forest. So the war effort also had a major impact, of course, on the lives of Americans and on Lake Forest residents. Many, like Dr. Proxmire, joined up in the military, whether by volunteering or through the draft. And thousands of members of the Navy and Army were trained right in our backyard at Great Lakes or Fort Sheridan. So here what you see is a photo of a wartime parade through Market Square. They were actually about to dedicate the Market Square flagpole to the troops serving in Europe. And if you look closely below the tower by the red arrow, you can see a banner for the War Emergency Union. This was an organization created to marshal money and labor for the war effort. And unleashed spaces in Market Square were given over to this purpose. A Red Cross office opened in the Northern Tower shop, where first aid classes and certain surgical dressings were taught, and they packed care packages for soldiers. So at the time, everyday items like sugar, meat, and gasoline were being conserved so they could be shipped to Europe or used to produce military supplies. Massive nationwide Liberty Bond campaigns were launched for people to contribute money toward the war effort. And the main sources of media, newspapers, films shown at new theaters, were focused on the war. And people were used to making sacrifices. That year, Lake Forest Day was not held. And this was important in part because it meant that the Lake Forest Contagious Hospital had lost its main fundraiser. So the hospital was facing some financial issues as it competed for donations with war-related efforts. And I want to emphasize, again, the proximity of Great Lakes and Fort Sheridan, right? Local residents and the soldiers and sailors stationed there were used to coming and going freely in town and on base, whether to provide support, visit friends and relatives, take in the base's weekly reviews, or to host parties or events like you see here. The women of the YWCA are in their clubhouse in Market Square. So we'll see shortly how this facilitated the spread of influenza locally. Before I get into that, I'm gonna provide a brief sort of zoom out and provide a wider view and look at the US as a whole and how influenza took hold. So it was into this context of a country at wartime that the influenza virus entered, right? And though there's not 100% agreement among researchers about where the pandemic started, many studies actually indicate an origin in February or March of 1918 in Kansas, when a flu outbreak was reported in a military training camp there. And that area of Kansas was home to large pig farms and was also a stopping point for many migratory birds. And this could have provided the right breeding ground for the virus. So as these Kansas troops were sent on to other camps, visited home on leave, and departed for England and France, this wave of influenza spread across the country and ultimately the globe. However, although this particular strain was very contagious, at first it seems to have been comparatively mild. Death rates were not too much beyond what doctors expected from the normal seasonal flu, so few alarms were sounded. It was the wartime conditions that gave the virus its name, of course. You can see that here in Lake Forester newspaper headline. The first influenza wave hit both warring armies in France in April. But although many contracted it, troops dismissed it as three-day fever. The only sustained attention the virus got came when it swept through Spain and sickened the king. And the press in Spain, which was not at war, wrote at length about the disease, unlike the censored press in the warring countries, since they all wanted to maintain a show of strength before their enemies. So it became known as the Spanish flu, although it did not originate there. So the close quarters and constant reinforcements of the warring armies offered the influenza virus a large number of fresh hosts. And at some point in late summer 1918, the virus mutated, and a far, far deadlier second wave soon spread across the world in September through shipping ports and troop movements. And I'll quickly throw some numbers at you, but as I do remember that the total population of the world was much smaller then, so only about a quarter of what it is today. But what happened in the fall of 1918 was the deadliest disease outbreak in human history, much deadlier than the war. Over 675,000 Americans died of influenza, more than 10 times the number of soldiers that died in combat in the war. About 28% of our population probably was infected, around 30 million people. It was everywhere, rich and poor, from major cities to remote Alaskan villages. Across the world, influenza killed somewhere between 20 and 50 million people. It infected probably about 500 million people, which was around a third of humanity. So here you can see a graph charting deaths from all causes in New York, London, Paris, and Berlin. The peaks in October and November represent that second influenza wave. So just like the seasonal flu today, the influenza virus that caused the pandemic attacked the respiratory system, spread through droplets from coughing, sneezing, and talking that could be transmitted through the air or picked up from surfaces. So often the flu just causes chills, fever, and fatigue, right? But this was a very virulent strain of influenza, which we now know is H1N1, which launched a powerful attack on the lungs. Victims could die within days or hours of developing symptoms. Sometimes their skin turned blue, their lungs would fill with fluid that caused them to suffocate. Many other victims died of bacterial pneumonia, a secondary infection that closely followed in lungs weakened by influenza. Sometimes the flu attacked with such swiftness that someone could feel well in the morning and be dead by evening. This very rapid incubation period presented severe challenges, but it did have a perverse silver lining. that we can see more clearly today from our perspective. Unlike with COVID-19, those infected could be quickly identified and quarantined. So there was something else strange about this influenza virus. Normally, the seasonal flu tends to be more dangerous for the elderly and for small children, which is the U-shaped curve you see graphed here with the dotted lines, which represents death rates for the seasonal flu in 1911 through 1917. But the 1918 influenza was more prone to strike young, healthy people, adults between the ages of 20 and 40. That's the W shape you see in the solid black line, charting death rates in 1918. And so influenza and attendant pneumonia was killing people in the prime of life: wage earners, parents, soldiers, and essential war workers. Modern research has hypothesized a few different reasons for this. The 1918 virus caused a particularly violent immunoresponse, and maybe the stronger the immune system, like in young, healthy people, the more violent the response and the more likely the body was to attack itself. Some epidemiologists have also hypothesized that earlier flu waves back in the 1890s may have conferred some immunity on those over 40. At any rate, in part because it struck down so many youthful people, the influenza pandemic lowered the average life expectancy in the US by more than 12 years. It went from 51 in 1917 to 39 in 1918. So when the 1918 flu hit, doctors and scientists were unsure what caused it or exactly how to treat it. Unlike today, there were no effective vaccines or antiviral drugs. There were no breathing machines. Microscopes couldn't even see something as incredibly small as the virus until the 1930s. So what made any difference at all really was only bed rest and nursing, since the influenza was most potent when a secondary bacterial infection caused pneumonia. And so prevention rather than treatment was the key. Guidance for prevention was wide-ranging. Some was just good common sense advice for a healthy lifestyle, though ultimately with little impact on contracting the flu, like eating citrus, for example. Hot lemonade was an old folk remedy that became so prevalent that the worldwide price of lemons skyrocketed. The menthol cough suppressant Vicks Vapor Rub also flew off the shelves, according to the Lake Forester ad you can see here on the right. People were urged to use products like Lysol to clean surfaces in their home and disinfect clothes and sheets and handkerchiefs. And if sanitary cleaning was not possible, it was actually advised to burn handkerchiefs and things like that. Paper tissues didn't become common until several years later. Although doctors and scientists didn't possess the tools we have today, they did have experience with the spread of disease and understood how people could be infected by droplets. There was a lot of helpful guidance available about the benefits of open air and social distancing back in 1918. Health commissioners across the country encouraged people to do things like place a piece of paper over telephone receivers, walk home from work instead of taking the train, open your windows, and substitute a salute for handshakes and kisses. In the early days of the virus, the health departments around the country also launched major campaigns seen on posters like this one, urging people to cover their mouth when they sneezed and coughed and telling them not to spit. Random spitting in the street was much, much more common in prior centuries than it is today with our improved dental health, but its decline is also a public health success story of the influenza pandemic. So World War I had a major effect on the influenza crisis in the US. The healthcare system was vastly overwhelmed by the number and severity of cases and further hampered by a shortage of healthcare professionals. Thousands of nurses and doctors, like Lake Forest Dr. Proxmire, had been deployed to military camps in the front lines. Thousands of others, not having the level of PPE that we do today, were struck down by the virus themselves. Another worker shortage had a significant impact on daily life. In the Chicago area and around the country, influenza produced a shortage of telephone operators, many of whom were young women in their 20s, a demographic hit particularly hard. And so here you can see a notice that appeared in the Lake Forester newspaper in October 1918, in which the Chicago Bell Telephone Company asked people not to make calls unless absolutely necessary because their workforce was so depleted. One thing it's important to note about the 1918 influenza pandemic is that responses varied widely across the country. These were largely led by local and state health departments. Politicians were completely focused on the war effort, and the war effort, in fact, significantly hampered what health departments could do. Nearly everywhere, leaders were particularly reluctant to overreact and cause panic. Wartime conditions of censorship and boosting patriotism caused overly optimistic pictures to be painted in the press, which led to a slow grasp of the reality of the situation. Also, the war needed to be conducted and paid for, and there was a lot of pressure to continue to hold massive fundraising parades that encouraged the sale of Liberty bonds. Many large cities across the country continue to hold these events, despite advice from health officials. Two cities whose response to the influenza virus are often compared, and you may have seen news stories to this effect early in the COVID-19 pandemic, are Philadelphia and St. Louis. And Philadelphia's Liberty Loan Parade was very ill-timed. It was just as cases were starting to rise exponentially, but before other preventative measures were in place. And so the parade became a super spreader event, with cases surging in the following days. St. Louis, on the other hand, canceled its parade and took early action in closing public places and banning gatherings. And so you can see from the graph, St. Louis was able to, as we say, flatten the curve. And all told, Philadelphia reported nearly 14,000 deaths from the pandemic, and St. Louis less than 3,000. Chicago, as we'll see, was somewhere in the middle. Another way that the response to influenza varied across the country was in the wearing of masks. Public health officials were in agreement about their usefulness. Doctors and nurses wore them. Red Cross chapters began to make them for men in military camps. Public workers were issued masks, like you see here. Short of wearing a mask, people would often hold up their handkerchiefs to their faces on the street or the train. Although it was highly encouraged in the East, official mask-wearing ordinances mainly popped up in the West. There was no official mask mandate in Illinois or Lake Forest during the pandemic. But Lake Forest residents would have seen how-to guides and photographs and advertisements like this in the newspaper, popularizing the wearing of masks. Of course, the 1918 masks were largely made of gauze, right, which even layered several times was still full of holes. So they were not terribly effective, but better than nothing. So now we're going to zoom back in to see what was happening locally. The influenza pandemic had probably originated in the US in March, and it boomeranged back to the US in late August and early September as the more virulent second wave. As soldiers and goods were being transported back and forth from Europe. And so in our area, the first documented cases occurred about September 8th at Great Lakes Naval Station, which makes sense since troops were constantly moving in and out of there. The naval authorities tried to respond quickly, even as a dozen cases quickly turned into hundreds. Infected sailors were put in quarantine. All 50,000 sailors on base were issued daily nose and throat sprays. Not sure how effective that was, but routine work was even suspended, and the men were encouraged to spend time outside, since Admiral William Moffett, who had charged the base, believed that plenty of fresh air would prevent the disease. Within days, all leaves were canceled for enlisted men, both at Great Lakes and other camps, which were facing similar outbreaks. And this resulted in the first ever quarantine marriage performed at Great Lakes, when Maddie McCoo had traveled up from Kansas City to marry her fiance, but the problem was he was stuck in quarantine at Camp Perry in Ohio with no end in sight. So finally, the local chaplain arranged to perform the marriage remotely by telephone. And according to the Chicago Tribune, the groom was actually in ignorance about what was transpiring until called to headquarters a few minutes before the ceremony. So I guess didn't have time to get nervous. But at Great Lakes, Admiral Moffett definitely had many of the right ideas, but the men were in such close quarters that it was already spreading like wildfire. And unfortunately, for many days, the base continued to allow visitors, which is what facilitated community spread. Surrounding towns like Waukegan, Lake Bluff, and Lake Forest would be the next dominoes to fall. By September 23rd, Great Lakes reported 4,500 cases and 65 deaths, while attempting to insist the flu was confined and on the downturn. It wasn't. Through the fall, they reported nearly 1,000 deaths on the base. A fascinating oral history exists that gives a very visceral sense of the anguish of working at Great Lakes at this time. Josie Mabel Brown, a newly trained nurse from St. Louis, was assigned duty at Great Lakes in late September of 1918. And she recalled her experiences in a 1986 interview. At age 100, she said, "There were so many patients, we didn't have time to treat them. We didn't take temperatures. We didn't even have time to take blood pressure. We would give them a little hot whiskey toddy. That's about all we had time to do." By late September, Great Lakes had apparently put out a call through the whole Chicago region for all the winding sheets, which is what was used to wrap the dead, that could be found. Caskets were in short supply. Nurse Brown recalled, "As the boys were brought in, we would put winding sheets on them, even if they weren't dead. You would always leave the left big toe exposed and tag it with the boy's name, rank, and next of kin. As one boy lay dying in bed, one waited on the stretcher on the floor for the bed to empty. Each morning, as the ambulance drivers would bring in more sick boys, they would carry the dead bodies out. The morgue was stacked to the ceiling with bodies because the casket makers could not make boxes fast enough." So the residents of Lake Forest were aware of some of what was going on at Great Lakes. The quarantine had been publicized. Local women were stepping up to help, knitting sweaters to keep those struck with influenza warm, making face masks for them. It was known that many deaths had occurred. This in memoriam message was emblazoned across the Lake Foresters' front page for the men of Great Lakes. But health authorities like Chicago Health Commissioner John Dill Robertson were still sort of playing down the threat of spread in the press so as not to incite panic. So at this stage, influenza still seemed remote from their everyday life. But reading through the local newspapers, you can almost see the moment when influenza transitioned from being a foreign virus or a wartime disease afflicting soldiers to being a painful reality at home among friends and neighbors. Steadily from Great Lakes, influenza spread through the suburbs. One by one, the cities and towns of the North Shore began to document cases, then dozens, then hundreds. In the last week of September, the communities began to understand the direness of their situations. Their small community hospitals filled, friends and neighbors died, city authorities closed gathering places. So the first cases were reported in Lake Forest around September 17th. And at that time, health authorities ordered windows on interurban trains to be kept open. On September 19th, the Libertyville Independent wrote that a rapid spread of the disease was registered in Lake Forest and Waukegan. On September 21st, the Lake Forester newspaper printed this editorial, urging people not to be alarmist. If you have a cold, it doesn't mean you're a Spanish influenza victim. And the big news then really was the upcoming Liberty Loan Drive, right? But that day, Lake Forest had reported nearly 100 cases, including 6 students at Lake Forest College. And by September 26th, Lake Forest had between 300 and 400 cases. So by September 28th, things were coming to a head. Local business, the Joan Tea Shop in Market Square, had to close because both the proprietor and cook had taken ill. Halsey and Gorton schools were ordered by the Board of Education to be closed for a week. According to one Lake Forester reporter who did a survey of 3 public school teachers, quote, "In one room of 24, 14 were out. In one room of 25, 15 were out. In the third room, only 6 were down." The private schools also closed. Lake Forest Academy sent its boys home for 2 weeks. Ferry Hall had already been under a self-imposed quarantine. Then the next day, September 29th, church services were canceled in Lake Forest, Highland Park, and Waukegan for, quote, "the first time in their histories." The newspaper published obituaries for 3 of the first local deaths from the flu. On Monday, September 30th, Aubrey Moran and the Board of Health officially announced that all public gatherings in Lake Forest were banned. Schools, theaters, and churches, as well as local organizations, would remain closed until further notice, and public funerals were prohibited. One place that did remain open was the Red Cross shop, which continued to churn out emergency supplies for Great Lakes and soldiers overseas. A systematic house-to-house canvass was organized in Lake Forest to report cases, put up placards on homes with illness, and distribute informational literature from the state health department. This was run by 24 local women volunteers, many of them teachers from the closed schools or members of local organizations like the YWCA or the Women's Club. On October 1st, 170 more cases were reported in Lake Forest. Both Alice Home Hospital and the Contagious Hospital were, as you imagine, overflowing. The city of Lake Forest actually took over the privately run Contagious Hospital. And to free up space at Alice Home, some long-term patients were moved elsewhere. One of these was the longtime Lake Forest College professor, John J. Halsey, for whom Halsey School is named. He was moved to a sanitarium in Winnetka. The President's House on Lake Forest College campus, which is the building pictured, it's now Patterson Lodge, was actually appropriated by federal authorities to use as a hospital for Lake Forest College's SATC, which was the Student Army Training Corps. And at the time, Lake Forest College had an acting president, Henry Wilkins Wright, and he resided elsewhere, but the home was actually still being inhabited by the wife of the previous president, John S. Nolan, who had resigned to do war work overseas in Italy. And Mrs. Nolan was apparently given 1 hour to move out. Other North Shore towns also found their small hospitals were overwhelmed with patients. Makeshift emergency hospitals were set up wherever a convenient building could be found. In Highland Park, Winnetka and Waukegan, Exmoor, Indian Hill, and Bowen country clubs were filled with hospital beds. Exmoor, pictured here, already had 54 patients and could accommodate up to 75. The next issue of the Lake Forester was delayed a few days because only one member of their staff was able to work. The paper reported that, quote, nearly every home has its sick ones and nearly every business house is working with about half or less of its normal force. This October 7th issue was filled with influenza information, including rules issued by the state health department and other items. From my research, I've become relatively familiar with the usual layout of the Lake Forester. And during this era, in a typical week, the paper might include 1, maybe 2 obituaries commemorating locals who passed away. But in this October 7th issue, there were 10. On October 12th, there were 10 again, many of them young, all dead of influenza or pneumonia. The paper labeled the page-filling columns deaths toll. So meanwhile, another sort of deaths toll was ringing out in Lake Forest. On October 7th, leaders of 4 of the churches in town petitioned City Council to toll the fire bell 3 times at noon, and then at 12:01 every day, calling the people of the community together in silent prayer for the welfare of our country and for victory with peace in our cause. So influenza made its mark on both the wealthy and the working class locally, although by far more deaths came from the ranks of the latter. Many club meetings and parties were canceled. Weddings had to be limited to immediate family members only. Prominent society leaders like Francis Dibley Sprague and Laura Thorne Donnelly were stricken with the virus. The entire Hugh J. McBurney household, family members and staff, fell ill. The Solomon Smith family all had it, including their daughter Mary, who caught it at school at Dobbs Ferry. Others in the upper classes, though, sort of continued largely as they had before, with small luncheon parties at the casino club or one last round of golf before the weather turned. However, as the cartoon you see here indicates, the flu had become so pervasive that even among those out and about, there was nervousness, suspicion, and even guilt about their activities. One strategy the wealthy had at their disposal that was largely inaccessible to the working class was the ability to travel at will, to try to outrun or at least maybe outrest the virus. And spas and resorts like French Lick Springs in Indiana tried to tap into this urge, which you can see on this Chicago Tribune newspaper advertisement. And more than a few Lake Foresters took this precaution, but the influenza virus was everywhere. So back in Lake Forest, the virus reached its peak by about October 12th. The house-to-house canvass then reported 600 cases. And remember, this is a town of 3,500. With one teacher mentioning that her territory averaged at least one case in half the homes that she visited. During the canvass, women also distributed soup to homes where caregivers were stricken. By the next week, October 19th, thanks to a combination of the social distancing measures and the fact that the virus had run through such a large swath of the population so quickly, influenza was finally on the wane in Lake Forest. Churches planned to open the next day, schools on Monday, and although the ban on other social gatherings remained in place for a couple more weeks. However, even as the North Shore suburbs were planning to reopen, the South was rapidly approaching a crisis point. By the beginning of October, influenza had spread down from the northern suburbs to Chicago. At first, like much of the rest of the country, Chicago's health commissioner, John Dill Robertson, was reluctant to overreact and cause panic. He made confident public pronouncements, asserting in late September, "We have Spanish influenza well in hand." Robertson perhaps did not have the ideal qualifications for a pandemic of these proportions. He was a dentist and had been appointed to the role more because of his successful work on Chicago Mayor William Hale Thompson's campaign than for any illustrious medical qualifications. In the early days of the virus, he started with an information campaign with posters put up in public places like this one, urging people to cover coughs and sneezes, not to spit, and to stay home if sick. However, in what was then the second largest city in the US, with so many people in such close quarters, measures like that could only be so effective. By the first weeks of October, cases increased exponentially, with hundreds of deaths and thousands of new cases each day. Hospitals filled, people often suffered at home without care. And finally, on October 15th, after strong action by the state health authority, the Illinois Influenza Advisory Commission, stricter measures were put in place in Chicago as well. Theaters and dance halls were closed, public gatherings prohibited, with some exceptions. Smoking was banned on train cars, which actually Robertson had wanted to do for years, and funerals limited to 10 people or less. Factories were urged to stagger work schedules, so not everyone would be commuting at once. However, unlike in the more affluent North Shore communities, Health Commissioner Robertson did not feel he could close schools, since it was thought in the cities that children were safer in school than running around unsupervised on the streets. However, absenteeism was at nearly 50% due to illness and parental concern. Robertson also did not close churches, deeming them good for morale, but both churches and schools were required to keep windows and doors open at all times for ventilation. Robertson had received the new guidance from the state health authority on October 11th. Unfortunately, on October 12th, Chicago was to hold its own Liberty Loan Parade, a massive event like the one we saw in Philadelphia. And Robertson did not see how he could cancel it at this late date, so the event proceeded. Over 100,000 people gathered downtown for the parade. These parade goers were, however, given apparently strict instructions to, quote, "Go home, remove all clothing and rub the body dry and put on warm clothing," a flyer urged. "Take a laxative when you reach home and you will minimize your chance of catching the disease." This advice was a bit suspect, but fortunately, by the time Chicago held its parade on October 12th, people were a bit more cautious and likely to wear masks or use handkerchiefs. And also many people had already contracted the flu. So the increase in deaths did not quite reach the tragic magnitude seen in Philadelphia. However, an increase there certainly was. You can see from the graph that in Chicago, influenza and pneumonia deaths peaked on October 17th, which was 5 days after the parade. By late October, though, cases were on the wane in Chicago. A combination of the eventual social distancing regulations, quarantines, and again, the fact that it had infected and killed so many people so fast. So the quarantines in the city were gradually lifted over the first week of November. Chicago had been hit hard by this pandemic, particularly in immigrant neighborhoods, which had crowded living quarters, less access to medical care, and greater likelihood of underlying conditions or secondary infection. In the fall alone, at least 10,000 died, likely an underestimate. John Dill Robertson's preliminary report documented 40,000 cases, but this was definitely a vast underestimate, given that hospitals were overrun and most suffered at home, and Chicago didn't have the same house-to-house canvas ability that the North Shore suburbs did. The real number could have been more like 10 times that. However, on the comparative scale of large cities in the US, Chicago fared all right, closer to the St. Louis end of the spectrum than Philadelphia. By the first week of November, the second wave of influenza had largely run its course in Lake Forest, and all quarantines were lifted. Our local counterparts of 1918 faced about a month of quarantine, which is a contrast, right, to our situation today with coronavirus. That in part has to do with the stark difference in the incubation period for the two viruses. Influenza sickened and killed its victims much faster, and it was also less likely to be asymptomatic. Through the whole pandemic, including the third wave, which I'll discuss in a minute, the Lake Forest, Lake Bluff area probably faced about 1,000 cases and suffered at least 25 deaths, including some residents who died overseas while serving in the war. The last few weeks have been trying ones to many of us, wrote the editor of Lake Forester, but all should be glad it was no worse and we are at last free of the disease. So throughout the influenza pandemic, it was the war that was the first priority and that maintained its place on the front pages. On November 11th, the armistice was signed and World War I ended. Locally, Lake Forest held an impromptu victory parade. The line of residents who wished to toll the bell at City Hall in jubilation was long, and some were so enthusiastic that it finally broke. The bell, of course, had recently had a workout, and so perhaps its structural integrity was already compromised from the daily tolling at noon for the minute of prayer. The third wave of influenza, which lasted from late 1918 through spring 1919, was as a whole much more mild, but struck unevenly, with some places like the Western US, Australia, and France, where President Wilson caught it, were hit much harder than other places. Lake Forest saw a few more scattered outbreaks with attendant quarantines at Ferry Hall and at the Lake Bluff Children's Home. This latter was particularly ill-timed, coming right at Christmas, when it had seemed that the children would actually be able to continue the tradition of Yuletide visits to local family homes, after all. But a New Year's party featuring a visit from Santa Claus was organized by the community after the quarantine was lifted. One main way the legacy of influenza was felt in the community occurred at the hospitals. In the same Lake Forester newspaper issue that announced the armistice, and just 2 short weeks after the influenza quarantine had been lifted, this news article appeared, announcing that a plan was underway to consolidate Alice Home Hospital and the Contagious Hospital under one umbrella and to create an endowment fund. This was accomplished quickly. The Lake Forest Hospital Association was organized in January 1919. And so clearly the influenza epidemic had laid bare the fact that with Alice Home on Lake Forest College property and its plan of expansion left unfinished, with the Contagious Hospital on precarious financial footing, and with the fact that the two institutions were run separately, creating inefficiencies, with all those issues combined, the city of Lake Forest and its residents were not receiving quite the optimal medical care. And so the consolidation sought to resolve this. And also quickly accomplished in the wake of the pandemic were those necessary capital improvements, thanks to several generous local donors stepping to the plate. Before 1919 had ended, the new wing had been added to Alice Home and new cottages to the Contagious Hospital. Follow-up outbreaks of the influenza without nearly the same devastating effect occurred more on a seasonal basis in the next few years following the 1918 pandemic. So as you can see from this January 1920 front page notice in the Lake Forester, this time the community knew what to do and they were not messing around. However, the most indelible legacy was doubtless the number of local lives that influenza cut short. Children left without parents, husbands and wives without spouses, residents without their family members, neighbors and friends. And so I thought I would end this talk by sharing a reminiscence of those community members who died of influenza and pneumonia during the pandemic. Here, William Fletcher, age 39, died in France of tuberculosis, but it was likely following influenza on September 13th. He was a member of the 8th Illinois or 370th U.S. Infantry, which was the only African-American regiment in World War I to be commanded entirely by Black officers. He was also a veteran of the Spanish-American War and would often play bugle for town events and military funerals. His own funeral was held much later in January 1921 when his body finally arrived from overseas. Charles DeLacy, age 23, died of pneumonia on September 15th. He worked for J.B. Farwell Company and had been in training at Great Lakes as a gunner's mate. Grace Potter Moeller, 36, died at Alice Home Hospital on September 22nd of pneumonia. She'd been in the hospital for another complaint, but then caught pneumonia while she was there. She lived west of Great Lakes, but attended First Presbyterian Church and was a Sunday school teacher. Before her marriage, she'd been a nurse, and her last words to the Alice Home nurses were, quote, "I'm going west. Cheer up, girls, and be brave." Dr. W.L. Newbert was a dentist of German descent, and he died September 24th of pneumonia at Alice Home Hospital. He'd been trying to get into the service, but his parentage had prevented his being accepted. Corporal Joseph W. Steele, age 28, died of bronchopneumonia in a hospital in France on September 24th. The day his unit, Company F of the 129th Infantry, had been scheduled to leave for the front, he had taken ill. And his body was not returned to his family in Lake Forest until August of 1920, when a military funeral was held. Ada Town Vickerman, age 32, wife of Robert Vickerman, whose family owned a large farm just west of town off Waukegan Road, died September 25th of pneumonia. She had 8 children. William Attridge, 38, died at home of pneumonia on September 30th. He was married with 2 children and was a descendant of one of the first white families to build a home in Lake Forest. He ran a local meat market with his brother. Walter J. Stevens, 19. He had enlisted in the Navy and had been recently transferred to Philadelphia. His obituary reads, quote, "We all knew him as just a dear boy, but the boy assumed a man's duties when he went down to Great Lakes last June and enlisted in the U.S. Navy." Catherine Shields, 21, died September 30th. Her obituary says she was, quote, "a young lady whose beautiful character and sunny disposition endeared her to everyone who knew her. She was the idol of her 7 brothers, to whom she was not only a loving sister, but also a devoted little mother, both of her parents having passed away earlier." Mary Cowie Atchison, 24, died of pneumonia at Alice Home on October 3rd. She had a 4-year-old son and 2 brothers in service. Her husband, John, was called home from Pittsburgh, where he was working for Swift & Company. Margaret Mulholland Moran, 36, died on October 3rd. She had 4 children, including a 10-month-old baby. Mrs. H.P. Manley, the wife of the president of the Waukegan Hammond Motor Trunk Company, died in Lake Bluff on October 5th after a 24-hour attack of influenza. She left 2 children. Frank Ewens, 39, died October 6th at home, leaving a wife and 1 son. His residence, an apartment in Market Square, had actually seen 5 serious cases of influenza. Carl Vogt, 31, died of pneumonia October 6th at Alice Home. He was a carpenter and contractor by trade and left a wife and infant son. Catherine Helen Garrity, 18, died October 9th of pneumonia. She was a resident of Lake Bluff and member of the senior class at Deerfield Shields Township High School. Olga Anderson Runquist, 53, died of pneumonia October 9th. She was a Swedish immigrant with 3 children. Quote, "She took to her bed with influenza after nursing her family safely through the disease. She not only never turned a deaf ear to any call for assistance, but was ever alert to see and hear the calls for service, which she rendered so unselfishly and so modestly," her obituary says. Edwin C. Larned, 32, who died at Bordeaux, France of pneumonia on October 11th and was buried in a Red Cross cemetery there. He was a graduate of Lake Forest Academy and Harvard and was serving overseas with the Red Cross. Margaret Cowie McCratcher, 31, died at Alice home on October 13th. She had 2 small children and was actually the second daughter of John Cowie to die of influenza, with Mary Cowie Aitchison, her sister. Wilhelm Klaus, 33, died of pneumonia October 13th at the Contagious Hospital, and he was the butler for the Francis Cooley Farwell family. It was a particularly devastating week for the Sandy family of Lake Forest. Reuben R. Sandy, 26, died of influenza October 19th. He'd been with the hospital court training with an infantry regiment in Camp Fremont, California. And his parents received news of his death on the same day as a telegram informing them that his brother, William, had been killed in action in France. Frank Bourgeois, 26, died at the Contagious Hospital October 19th of pneumonia. He was a blacksmith and left a wife and a child who were both also at the hospital convalescing of the same disease. Harry Barker, 39, died in Chicago on October 21st. His parents were residents west of Lake Forest at Everett, and he was in the milk business and was a driver and collector for the Lake Forest Laundry. Laura Thorne Donnelly, 51, died indirectly at the hands of influenza. She actually suffered a stroke on November 10th following an illness of influenza the previous month. And she was very involved in Red Cross work. No matter what the hour, the scarcity of workers, or the apparently insurmountable obstacles in the way of fulfilling some sudden demand, Mrs. Donnelly's gallant spirit rose to the occasion, and at whatever personal cost assisted in carrying out the service. Ernest Hopple, 26, died at the home of his mother on December 5th of pneumonia. So this would have been in the 3rd wave. He was a clerk in the Lake Forest post office where, quote, by his genial disposition, he made a friend of every patron of the office. Oscar Jelling died of disease in France and was buried in England. He was attached to the Engineer Corps as a private. Born in Denmark, he was formerly in the employ of J. Acton Armour, and it was written in his obituary that, quote, he had lived in Germany about 4 years and detested the German people, which is why he enlisted. And finally, William Gernens, I think, 43, who died at home on Woodland, January 20th of pneumonia. He was in the milk business and left a wife and 2 children. So quite a toll, and almost all, young people between the ages of 20s, 30s, and 40s. So Lake Forest and Lake Bluff were in line with the nation in that way. Okay, that concludes my presentation, but I am happy to answer any questions or hear if I'm interested if any of your families had connections to the influenza as well.
Thanks so much, Laurie. Yeah, if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, you can go ahead and do so, or you can put the question in the chat if that is your preference.
Sure, I have a question, Laurie. Recognizing that the timeline was obviously much more condensed than what we're dealing with today, was there any sentiment of kind of shutting down, travel in and out, like from Chicago to Lake Forest or anything like that?
It doesn't seem so, not at all. I mean, in part because of the war, and nothing could be shut down really for that reason. But that wasn't something that I read was ever discussed as a measure. I mean, I think while they did understand a lot about infection, the benefits of that were not seen to outweigh what needed to happen on a daily basis in the country, I think. But it's a very good question. But yeah, I mean, they really did not have to, endure sort of the protracted period of quarantine that we did, number one. And number two, they were also a little bit more used to, I think, sacrificing for the public good, right? Having been at war for a year. So that was just a little bit more ingrained in the ethic of everyone at the time.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. The two hospitals, you said they were consolidated and put under private ownership. Did that turn into that is Lake Forest Hospital, how it came? But
Yes.
neither of those two structures are in existence today, right?
No, exactly. Yeah, that's a great question. So the Ellis Home and the Contagious Hospital consolidated and created the Lake Forest Hospital Association. But I think even in the early 20s when this was, and 1919 when this was done, it was not seen as totally ideal anymore that Lake Forest Hospital was on Lake Forest College's campus, and like they didn't even own the land it was on, number one. And both buildings were sort of small scale cottage style, more for a village than a growing town. Also, some of the diseases that the Contagious Hospital was sort of intended for throughout the 20s and 30s became much less prevalent. And so the Contagious Hospital, I think, ends up closing in the late 1930s. And at that time, it was the Lake Forest Hospital Association received a gift of land from the Dick family to build a new hospital in the western part of town, where Lake Forest Hospital is today. And that was built in 1942 as Lake Forest Hospital. And Ellis Home was transferred to Lake Forest College, which turned it into a dormitory. And it served as a dormitory for about 20 years and then I think was demolished in the 1960s. Great question.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat, Laurie. So Christine Halverson says, thank you for the thorough research. What precautions were taken the next year to avoid the flu, and what was the timeline for developments for a flu vaccine in the following years?
Well, I think a flu vaccine was not that was not developed until like the 1930s, as I recall. I think there's, so this slide sort of shows some of the precautions that were taken. Basically, the people were sort of self-quarantined much earlier, and it was sort of run more efficiently, and the community was at the ready to close things and shut things down if necessary in 1920, 1921, but it ended up not being necessary. It just wasn't as deadly of a flu virus anymore. But yeah, I think the vaccine ended up being developed in the 1930s, although I'm not as expert on that. Thank you for the question.
We have time for one more if anybody has any more questions. All right, well, if not, thank you all again.
There is one more.
Oh, there is one? Okay, great.
This is a real long shot, but I'm just curious if you have any comparison between the percent of deaths to the flu in Lake Forest relative to the population compared to the deaths in the coronavirus today.
Oh, that's really interesting. My guess is it's higher from
the 1918 would have been higher than
right, that it would be higher. I mean, if and I don't have the exact statistics for Lake Forest, and the press would sometimes combine the number of cases in Lake Forest and Lake Bluff. They didn't always. But I think the approximation I had made was about 25, which they have a population of 3,500, plus 800, I guess 4,300. I think that's still, even at this point, still going to be a slightly higher percentage than now. But this has been such a much longer period, that I think it could end up being more similar depending on how long we go on.
Yeah.
But that's a great question. I think
It'd
it would be
a fun thing to look
interesting.
at. Yeah.
It would be interesting to find that exact data.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in this evening. We have a couple other upcoming programs next month. We have a book talk on April 8th about the U.S. Civil Rights Trail with Deb Douglas, and on the 22nd with John Wassick, who's going to be looking at President Lincoln as an economist. So feel free to join us for those. Those will also be free programs. Thank you again. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you so much, Laurie, for your time and your thorough research and a very interesting presentation.
Of course. Thank you all.